Hello everyone, my name is Kristi Arzola and I've been painting with watercolors for over 20 years. These YouTube videos are just a way for me to share my knowledge, so if you enjoy your experience, give me a thumbs up, a follow, and share with your friends. For today's watercolor tutorial, we are going to be using these supplies here. You are more than welcome to pause the video and refer to the video description for an exact list of these supplies. But once you're familiar with my tutorials, you find I often use very repeatable, common things. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. These are the colors that I'll be using for today's Seahorse: lemon yellow, cadmium orange, cadmium red, cerulean blue, ultramarine, and Payne's gray. I did put a list of these in the video description, so you're welcome to pause the video and grab the colors. However, you can also just work with the colors you have and adapt. In all of my video tutorials, you will find that I provide both a reference photo and a line drawing that you can download for free. So if you haven't already, pause the video, refer to the video description, and you will find two links that lead to each. Once you have downloaded your line drawing, you can actually print it out at the scale you plan on painting it. On the back of the line drawing, if you don't have transfer paper, just take a traditional pencil, apply graphite all over the back of the line drawing, position it in place so the graphite is in contact with your watercolor paper, and then take a ballpoint pen and trace the line drawing. I feel personally less lines the better. That way you don't feel restricted in your creativity. But with just tracing using a ballpoint pen, your pressure is going to push that graphite onto your watercolor paper, essentially giving you a line drawing to paint. Once you feel happy with it, you can remove your line drawing and set that aside. Now, depending on the pressure you are using, you may have some areas where your lines are a little darker than others. Depending on the values you plan on using for today's painting, you may want to lighten some of those up. I personally will be using quite a few soft pastels, especially in some of the fins of this particular seahorse, as well as in the head. So in those areas, when it comes time, I will be lightening up those pencil lines. So to do that, I use a kneaded eraser, and I just look at the areas that I plan on having real soft color, and I just tap my eraser to soften the values in those areas. That way it's less likely to show up in the finished painting. Most of the boning in the seahorse, since I'm going to be providing some shadows, I feel like I'm going to be able to cover up most of those lines, so I'm not too worried about the rest of it. Now, I would like the boning of the seahorse to be a little lighter in value. So in order to just allow me to paint faster with less effort, I'm going to be using some masking fluid to just protect some of the boning and the highlight in the eye. That way I can paint the entire body of the seahorse in one go and then remove the masking fluid to provide details. Now, if you're not familiar with masking fluid, it's a liquid you apply to the paper. When it dries, it has a rubber or plastic-like finish, which resists the paint. And then you peel it up later after everything's dried, and it'll reveal the area of the paper you protected. It essentially just keeps paint out wherever you apply it. Now, masking fluid is notoriously bad for paintbrushes. So I like to put a small amount of Dawn dish soap in a little cup, and I thoroughly coat my paintbrush using that soapy water before I dip in my masking fluid. This basically just ensures that I don't ruin my tools and that the masking fluid will rinse out of my paintbrush with less effort. So I'm basically just going to be going through and putting a layer of masking fluid on the areas where I have boning. Now this will take a little while, but it is just as important as the paint, so I do want to take my time and I don't want to rush the application. Now notice how I haven't gone very far with my masking fluid, and I am already going to rinse it out of my brush using that soapy water before I re-dip in my masking fluid. This is just to ensure protecting my tools because I'm not using a cheap brush. So rather than it ruining, I rather rinse frequently as a precaution. Now I don't want to go too far with my masking fluid before I continue to re-rinse, just to ensure it does not adhere to the bristles of my paintbrush. As I get towards the end of the tail, the boning is more narrow. So I make a point to hold my brush more vertical, and I have very light pressure when I'm applying the masking fluid. The purpose is to ensure that I have nice narrow results on the boning and that my line work where I apply the masking fluid does not get too wide. So maintain a light touch, hold that brush more vertically than you would a pencil, and just barely touch the end of that round brush to your paper. Now, once I have all of the horizontal boning, I'm now going to go down through the center of the seahorse. Notice how I'm trying to kind of paint the center in as minimal brush strokes as possible. That simply helps us really make sure to have our sections lined up. And I'm going to keep this area a little wider as it goes across the center of my seahorse. But as it reaches the head, it begins to taper off and narrow. And same with when it comes to the bottom tail. It's not nearly as wide, so I have less pressure with my brush. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm really taking my time on the way I apply my masking fluid. If there's an area I'm unhappy with, rather than just telling myself, oh, it's fine, I'll actually wait for it to dry and then I'll remove that masking fluid and reapply. I've learned that it always just helps and gives me better results rather than settling for, the first pass kind of situation. Okay, so I've applied my masking fluid. I need a little bit more time for it to dry. So I am going to mix my paint colors while this is drying. But before I begin mixing paint colors, I really make sure to rinse that masking fluid out of my paintbrush really well. And then I go an additional step and I make sure to rinse all the soapy water out of my brush really well, because soapy water and mask or paint just does not mix real well. All right, so I'm going to switch to my number 10 round, and I'm going to use this brush to carry as much clean water as it is willing to hold over to my palette, and then I'm going to drag my brush across the rim of my palette to encourage some of that water to come out. I'm going to be mixing up a few different colors. So I am putting water in about 5 different wells so I can make all the colors I want. So one of the first colors I'm going to make is just a really soft kind of yellow orange. So I'm going to be using a little bit of lemon yellow, and then I'm going to get a little bit of cadmium orange. And if I think I'm close to the color I want, I'm going to test it out on a swatch. This is probably a little more vibrant than I'd like, so I'm going to add just a little bit more water to my mixture so it's not as vibrant. And that feels a little better. The next color I'm going to mix up is more of an orange red. So I'm going to use some of the cadmium orange again. But this time I'm going to get a little bit of cadmium red to add with it. And initially this color is going to be really vibrant, but I want it to be just a little bit more earthy. So I'm going to grab the smallest amount of cerulean blue just so it doesn't look as vibrant. So I just kind of continue to adjust my colors in small increments. And I test them out. And when I'm happy with it, I just move on to the next color. So this is that cadmium orange plus cadmium red and a little bit of cerulean blue, so it's not as vibrant, okay? So the next color I'm going to mix up is going to be more of a cerulean blue. I am going to add just a little bit of cadmium orange to it. If I go too much, you will be shocked to find that you'll create a green using cerulean blue and cadmium orange. So don't go too far with your orange. Just the tiniest bit is all it takes. But if you're heavy on the blue, you're going to get this really pretty kind of blue teal color. And then I am going to have a well with cerulean blue by itself. And then I will have a mixture of cerulean blue with just a little bit of Payne's Gray for a darker blue. And I might go even a little darker yet. So these are the colors I plan on using for the body of the seahorse. And in that time frame of mixing up those colors, I'm just double checking that my masking fluid has all dried. There's a couple areas that are a little questionable, so I'm going to hit those with the blow dryer before I begin painting. Now that all the masking fluid is completely dry, I can paint the entire body of the seahorse in one go, with the exception of the fins. Those I will do at a separate occasion. So for this, I'm going to use Wet and Wet. I'm going to apply clean water, and I'm just going to start just below the side fin on the head of the seahorse. So I'm trying my best to be mindful of where I apply my clean water. And because that masking fluid is there, I can go right on top of all the boning with my clean water. When I get out towards the outside edge of my seahorse, I really slow down and take my time. If you need to just lightly tint your clean water with one of your colors so it's easier to see, please do that, because that'll at least ensure that you're keeping your water in the area that you need to. So right now I'm just kind of evening out my water, making sure everything's glossy, but I don't have any standing puddles. So that's why I'm kind of taking my time. Some areas you'll discover absorb the water really fast, so they need a second application of water to stay damp, whereas other areas the water might puddle and sit on the surface, just depending on the paper you're using. There are a lot of cheaper papers out there. Be mindful that many of them are made from wood pulp and they will not absorb the water or paint in the way they're supposed to. A lot of times the moisture will just sit on the top surface of the paper, making it very challenging to get certain blends and effects. Other times it will absorb right in incredibly quickly, not giving you any working time, and then it will actually just stay permanently where it first touched down, and then you don't have any flexibility when you're trying to create different colors and blends. So the paper you use makes a significant difference. Now, the only reason I'm keeping my paper stationary is for the sake of the video. However, for those of you working at home, rotate your painting and work in a more comfortable manner so you don't have to bend your wrist or arm in awkward, non-natural positions just to get certain angles. So right now I feel like I have a nice even coat of water over the entire body and tail of the seahorse. If there's any areas where I have standing puddles, I dry my brush by dragging it across a sponge or paper towel, and I use my dry brush to tap the top surface of any puddles just to thin it out. I don't want puddles because they will not only just wash out all the beautiful colors I mixed up and make them a lot lighter than I intend, but the puddles will make it very difficult to control where your paint goes. So if you have a lot of standing puddles on your paper, it tends to get very challenging with controlling where your color goes. So just even things out. So I'm going to tip my paper so you can kind of see the gloss, but there's no puddles, but it is still very shiny, okay? So I'm going to start at the top and just kind of work my way down. So I'm going to grab that lighter cerulean blue as the first color. And I'm going to really dip my brush in the paint color and then drag my brush across the rim before I come to my painting. That way I have less chance of creating lots of puddles with my paint color. So I'm just going down the right side of the body with that cerulean blue, and because that masking fluid's there, I don't have to worry about painting around each individual boning and I just go right over top of it, which streamlines the process. I'm going to bring some of that cerulean blue towards the front on the lower half of the body, kind of in what I would consider the belly area. While this is all still wet, I'm going to grab that darker blue that I add the Payne's Gray to add some color on the front side underneath the head. If I have any puddling of paint, I can take a moment to dry my brush on a sponge or paper towel, and I can soak up the puddling of paint. Now the lower portion of my seahorse and the area of the tail is already losing that glossy shine, so I need to get my color in here rather quickly before it dries on me. So I'm putting a thin amount of water down, not puddles, because I don't want it kicking back up into the body where I've already added color. But I'm now going to be switching to that kind of teal blue that was made up. I'm then going to rinse my brush. I'm going to grab some of that lighter orange that has the yellow with it. Anytime I'm up against the outside edge of my seahorse, I just take my time with my brush. So I have my paint going right up to the edge, but with a nice, neat appearance. I'm being mindful of if there's puddles, I soak those up before I get too far away. That just ensures things dry a little more evenly. And I'm going to continue around this tail with that lighter orange. Once I reach towards the end of the tail, I'm going to be switching to that orange-red mixture. And this is just layer one, so don't think that you have to get all the shadows and textures in on this first layer. This is just something that we can kind of build off of. So I'm trying to be mindful of the edges where my paint meets up with my pencil line. I'm trying to make sure that that's nice and clean. I very much hold my brush more vertical, and I am light-handed. I'm barely applying any pressure. So it's just the very end of my brush touching my paper. Now that the entire body of the seahorse is wet, now that everything still has a very good glossy shine, this tells me I have some working time. So I can actually add some of that darker red just to the underside of the belly to try and create some shadows. If I want, I can add a little bit of that darker red towards the back end. Anytime I want to blend something, I just rinse my brush and tap my sponge to remove the excess water. And I use my damp brush to kind of push the color around on the wet surface so I can kind of create some blends between the colors in the way that I want. Now I think I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine blue. So I have a little bit of water on my palette first, and then I'm going to add some of the color. This is a really watered down ultramarine blue. I don't want it to be too dark, but this is a granulating color, and so it will add some nice texture to my seahorse. So I'm going to use this color and just blend it with some of the colors that are already on my paper. So I'm putting some of it just along the front, maybe along the back edge so it kind of gives a little bit more shadow. I want this ultramarine blue to continue underneath that side fin by the head. And then before this dries too much, I'm going to get a little bit of that Payne's Gray, add it to my ultramarine so it's a little darker, so I can kind of push the shadow that is created by the head. So I just want that to be a little darker. I can tap my brush to encourage it to release a little bit more pigment, and I can embrace adding some texture if I want. Looks like I have some little kitty hairs from my pet. So I'm just trying to lift that up out of the paint before it dries. Even when I keep him out of the studio, somehow his little hairs end up. All right, I'm going to need a stiffer brush for this. Okay, finally got the hair up. I did pick up some paint from that area in that process, so I can just re-add some of that softer orange-yellow mixture. But otherwise, some areas on the body of the seahorse are already losing that glossy shine. So that's a visual indicator that I need to just accept the body colors for what they are in this first pass, and any additional details need to come later. So I'm going to give that some space to dry, and I'm going to jump up to the very top of the head where I still have some boning. So I'm going to put just a little bit of clean water, not much. I'm going to stay out of the head and out of that side fin. And I'm just doing a thin amount of water so I can add some color. And I'm only adding the water just to kind of avoid having brush strokes and textures in areas where I don't want it. So I'm going to make sure there's no puddles up there. And then I'm going to grab that cerulean blue. Trying to be nice and neat as I go up to my pencil edge. I'm going to make sure there's no puddles. And then I'm going to add some of that darker ultramarine blue with the added Payne's gray, just for some contrast towards the bottom and front edge. I use a clean, practically dry brush to help kind of control how much paint is on my paper. And I can also kind of push the colors around to make the blends that I want. Okay, so now while those areas are drying, I'm going to hop down to the mouth area of the seahorse. I'm going to be mindful of where I rest my hand. I don't want to rest it on wet paint. And I'm going to apply a little bit of clean water just to the front mouth area as well as the nose. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I don't care if the water hits the eye. I'm just not going to bring the water back so far that it comes in contact with the other areas of the body that are still drying. So although I've extended the water all the way back past the eye, I will only plan on painting just this front nose and mouth area of the seahorse. For this, I'm going to switch to my number 2 round, just so it's a smaller brush and I have better visibility of where I'm applying my paint color. I'm going to grab that lighter orange with the added lemon yellow. I didn't necessarily bring it right into the nose. I'm going to have a different color there. So I just focused more on the area of the mouth. And then I'm going to bring a little bit of this color just to the front portion of the head. Now before that area dries, I'm going to rinse my brush. I'm going to tap my sponge to dry it out right before I dip into some of that cerulean blue. And I'm going to add just a small amount of blue to the end of the nose, because why not? I'm going to add a little bit of the cerulean blue along the back portion of the mouth. And I'm just going to let that now dry. Any additional details can come on the second pass. So while these areas are drying, I'm going to mix up just a really soft, watered down gray for the side fins of the seahorse. So I'm using Payne's gray, and I'm just going to water it down quite a bit. And I'm always going to test out my values. And that's a little dark for my preference, so I'm going to lighten that up by adding more water. And I'm going to test it out again, and that's a little bit more of what I'm looking for. Now I can't paint those side fins until these other areas that I've already painted are completely dry. So I'm going to pause the video and hit them with the blow dryer. Now that everything is completely dry, I can proceed with painting these side fins. And again, my goal is really just to get a base color. I'm not going to be doing any texture just yet. So I'm putting in just a small, thin amount of clean water. I'm not even going to make myself feel pressured to bring it right up to the edge. I'm okay with leaving a little area of white that is without water in between the space. I'd rather do that than to have my water overextend into an area where I don't want it. So I'm making sure there's no puddles, just a nice thin amount of water. I'm going to dip in my soft watered down gray. I'm going to drag my brush across the rim so I don't cause puddling. And I'm just going to add a color of this gray on the side fin. Now I want the outer right edge to kind of be uneven. So I'm being willing to kind of move my brush in a wavy, kind of zigzag, asymmetrical way. That way I've got a nice, interesting edge. Now before this dries too much, I'm going to grab some of that darker ultramarine blue that has some of the Payne's gray. And I'm just going to add a little bit of that near the edge. And I'm going to rinse my brush and dry it off. And I'm just going to blend this a little bit. I just wanted a little hint of some color so it doesn't look too flat. So I'm just using a clean, dry brush to kind of pull and blend that color to give it some texture. Now I'm going to repeat the process to the back fin. So I start with a thin layer of clean water. I'm okay with leaving a thin area of just untouched white paper in between my sections. Like I said before, I rather do that than to accidentally end up with water in an area where I didn't intend it. Once I have a nice thin layer of clean water without the puddles, I'll grab that watered down gray. Once I have gray on my brush, I can more easily see where I'm applying the paint. So going right up to my edges is no longer intimidating because I can see where it is it's going. Now on the right edge of this back fin, I do want it to be asymmetrical and I want it to have some texture. And then before that dries, I'm going to make sure there's no puddles. And then I'm going to grab some of that ultramarine blue with the gray just up against the back area. Then I'm going to rinse my brush, get all the paint color out. I'll dry it off by tapping a sponge or paper towel. And then with this dry brush, I'm going to kind of gently push the color around on the surface. I'm not pressing down hard because my goal isn't to remove the color completely. My goal is to just kind of blend on the wet surface of my paper and push the colors around together. Once I'm kind of happy with the texture I've created, then I need to just let that dry. So while those fins are drying, I'm going to bring my attention back to the body of the seahorse. Now, before I remove my masking fluid, it's going to be a lot easier for me to establish some shadows around the boning while the masking fluid is still in place. So I'm going to use a number 6 round. I'm going to go to that ultramarine blue that has that added Payne's gray to it. And I'm going to put some shadows on the underside of the boning. So I'm just going right underneath each section to try and create a shadow. Anytime I dip in my shadow color, which is that ultramarine and Payne's gray, I drag my brush across the rim really well, just so I don't have too much paint on my brush, because it only takes just a thin amount to make a difference. Now, when I do this next shadow, I want to be mindful that I'm going to come in contact with the wet back fin. I'm trying to make sure my shadows are even-ish, but it's no big deal if they're not. Now, as I get down towards the tail, I want to begin to slowly change my shadow color just a smidge. So this time I'm going to be using the cerulean blue with the Payne's gray. I'm going to start switching to that cerulean blue and orange mixture where it's kind of like more of a teal. As I reach the tail, I'm going to be switching to that red and orange mixture for the shadows. Now the shadows, I want my light source to be coming more from the top. So I need to be kind of mindful with where I put my shadows. I also want to make sure to add some shadows to the horizontal boning at the top. So I'm returning to that ultramarine and gray mixture. and my little side fin is still wet and I came in contact with it. Whoops. So now that I kind of added a shadow to the horizontal boning, I'm now going to add a shadow to the vertical boning. So I'm going to use that Ultramarine and Payne's Gray mixture for the sections that are on kind of the body. As I come down, I'm going to be switching to more of that teal color, or actually let's do cerulean blue. Then I'm going to switch to my teal color. And I'm essentially just trying to stay to the right side with my shadows. And then I'll be switching to that orange-red mixture for the tail area. So while these areas are drying, I'm going to return to the head of my seahorse and just give it some color. So I'm going to start off with my number 6 round, and I'm going to apply some clean water. If I go into the area of the eye, I'm not worried about it. I only plan on adding color to the back portion of the head, but I will be extending this clean water towards the front just to ensure I don't kind of get an edge to where my color stops. Now I want to be mindful of this side fin, making sure the area is dry where it comes in contact with the head. That way I don't accidentally create a bloom. Once I have some water on the head, I make sure it's just nice and even. I have a nice little gloss there. I'm now going to grab that teal color that was made up of the cerulean blue and orange. I'm going to give it a good mix and then drag my brush across the rim. And I'm going to apply this color more towards the back portion of the head. I can add a little bit of this to the top forehead. I just don't want to bring so much of the color close to the eye, so I'm just being mindful of that. If your color is creeping towards the eye, you can simply rinse your brush dry it off real well, and then use your brush with firm pressure to kind of pick up the paint out of the areas where you don't want it. So I'm trying to maintain just a thin area of white that goes around the eye. If my paint starts to creep into that area, I simply dry my brush off or rinse it. Dry my brush off really well so it is very, very dry. And then I use my dry brush and I press down with firm pressure on my paper. And wherever I'm pressing down with my brush, it is picking up the paint out of that area. So it's kind of a great way to control how far your paint travels and to keep it out of certain zones. So I'm now going to give that head some time to dry, and I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to hit everything with a blow dryer so we can remove the masking fluid and proceed with additional details. Now that everything is completely dry, I can begin removing the masking fluid. However, I just noticed that the boning overlaps the back fin, so it's going to be much easier for me to get some texture on this fin now before removing the masking fluid. That way I don't have to worry about hitting the boning. So I'm just coming in with that soft gray, and I'm just adding some lines for some texture. And I'm just starting at the back, and then as I move out, I'm lifting my brush up and away so it kind of creates a tapered point. I can do the same thing on the side fin by the head. Using that light watered down gray, I can vary the length of my lines if I want. But as I move out and away from the head, I'm lifting my brush up and off the paper. So now that everything is dry on the body, I can remove the masking fluid. So you can either use just clean fingers and firm pressure to remove the masking fluid, but sometimes that can kind of take patience and a certain amount of pressure to really get everything off. I find that a rubber cement pickup works really well and makes removing masking fluid much easier. Plus, the masking fluid will stick to the edges of the rubber cement pickup, creating less of a mess on your painting surface. This is usually when we find out if we applied the masking fluid in a good way or not. So it's always kind of a surprise and a learning experience. We might discover, hey, that looks great. And we might discover, oh, there are some areas where I could have perhaps taken my time more or applied it more thickly, whatever that might be. Now I'm not removing it from the eye just yet because I haven't painted the eye. So right now that we've removed the masking fluid from the boning, it does leave the boning looking really, really bright. So what we can do is we can just add a little bit of tinted color to the boning in areas of the seahorse. So I'm going to take some of that yellow orange and I'm going to water it down. And in any of the areas where I have that yellow-orange on the body. I'm just going to add just a soft glaze of color on top of that bright white so it's not so bright. But I did water down this color a lot so it's like the consistency of tea. It just adds the tiniest hint of color so it's not such a bright white, and we can better see that boning and the way it extends over the outside edges of the body a little better. Now, as I move up and I start entering parts of the body where it's a little bit more blue in color, I'm going to be switching my glaze color to the blue. So I'm grabbing some of that cerulean blue, pulling it aside on my palette, and I'm going to water it down so it too is the consistency of tea, so just a tiny bit of color. And I can now go into these areas and add just a tint. And if your glaze is watered down enough, if you were to accidentally hit the background color, you shouldn't even notice. Like it should be barely even visible. So if your color, anytime you hit the background or the body of the seahorse, if it's really obvious where your glaze came in contact, that means you didn't water it down enough. So really water it down. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm going to use this same glaze of blue on the boning on top of the head. Now I'm going to need to water down and create a glaze of the red and orange mixture. So I'm really adding a lot of water to it, so it should be just really, really soft. All right, while that glaze is drying, I'm going to return to the head of the seahorse, and I'm going to start off with painting just the center of the eye. So I am using a darker Payne's Gray mixture with less water, because I do want this eye to be dark. I'm going to go right over top of the masking fluid I have there for that little white reflection. If there's puddles of paint on the eye, it might be difficult to control where that paint goes. So rinsing the brush and soaking up any puddling of paint will help make it easier to refine the outside edges of your circle. Controlling where a puddle goes is much more difficult, so just be mindful of how much paint is on the surface of your paper. While that eye is drying, I'm going to switch to my number 2 round, and I'm going to get that red and orange mixture. I'm going to drag my brush across the rim of my palette so I don't have too much paint on my brush. And I'm just going to hold my brush more vertically and just barely apply any pressure so I can get the mouth of my seahorse in. I feel like there's not much contrast between the forehead and the background color. So I can come in and add just a little bit of line work there to make that pop out. I can do the same thing with my watered down gray. I can use that just to improve contrast and bring attention to certain details. So this is my watered down gray, and I'm going across the top of the head for contrast. I can choose to outline some of the details on the head if I wish. I'm going to add just a little bit more line work to follow the contour, even on the underside of the jaw. I can also use this soft gray to create just the tiniest little nostril. Now I'm going to check on the status of the glaze on top of the boning, and if that's all dry, then we can continue to push our darks and push the contrast. So one of the things I want to do is kind of give the hint of more boning or structure in the seahorse. So I'm going to use that cerulean blue with the added Payne's Gray, and I want to kind of create a line that goes up the back of my seahorse. Now, anytime that line comes in contact with the boning, I want it to kind of curve around the boning. So it kind of gives a hint of the contour or shape of that part of the seahorse. So I'm just kind of doing a real subtle curved line. Now if I want, I can do that in other areas as well, just to push the contrast. I can even just use a little bit of line work with that cerulean and Payne's gray mixture to create a little bit more of a shadow. I want to create a shadow on the underside of the side fin. I can kind of add a little bit of shadow on just parts of the fin in the back if I wish. If I feel like the texture of the fin isn't bold enough or visible enough, I can add a second layer. Same with on the fin of the back. I just like to vary the length of my line work so it doesn't look like a perfect pattern. If there are areas where I want to make the shadow or color maybe a little bit more vibrant, I can come in with just a glaze of color just to darken up a few select areas to give just a little bit more dimension. Now, where the boning kind of crisscrosses at those intersection points, I'm going to use the cerulean blue with the Payne's gray mixture using my number 2 round, and I'm just going to kind of create a little bit more texture in these areas. So I'm kind of extending that underside shadow across the boning where they intersect. And then I'm just making a real thin line at the top to kind of indicate where the top of that boning is so it looks like they're overlapping. And then if I want, I can do a subtle curved line on either side just to give a little bit more texture. So we don't have to do that at every location, but if you do decide to do that throughout the tail, I would just encourage you to switch to your glazing colors for that area. So maybe using some of that teal or some of that, red glaze. Now that the eye is more dry, I'm going to use that watered down Payne's Gray, and I want to try and create a line that maintains even spacing all the way around the eye of the seahorse. And if it's got some wobbles and it's not exactly perfect, that's okay. Because I know from experience, if I keep going back in attempts to make it perfect, I actually just end up making the line larger and wider. So you got to ask yourself, when is it enough? And is it worth the risk going back in and continuing to play with it? I'm going to add just a little bit of texture on the back edge of the mouth here, just using little tick marks. I feel like the nostril isn't quite as dark as I'd like, so I'm going to darken that up a little bit. And right on the back of the head here against that side fin, I feel like I want that to be darker. So I'm using that ultramarine blue with the Payne's Gray, and I just want to darken up that shadow a bit. So I'm going to come right in and just create a line behind the elements of the head. I can push the shadows on the underside of that top fin. If I want, I can add a little bit of outline towards the top just so it kind of stands out more. But at this stage, you're basically just adding additional details that you personally want in your painting, giving it your style, and just stay true to yourself. You can add texture, you can add dots. There's really no rules. Once your eye is completely dry, you can remove that masking fluid. And otherwise, it's just a simple little seahorse. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'd love to see your finished painting, so do keep in touch. Give me a thumbs up, leave a comment, let me know what you liked and what you'd like to see next, and we'll see you next time. Happy painting!